It was a shameful period in Australia's history. Citizens were placed under virtual house arrest by state governments using extraordinary powers that were highly legally questionable. People were forced to leave their jobs just for refusing to be injected with a vaccine that hadn't been fully tested yet. Citizens were denied the right to leave their country. And worst of all, citizens were denied the right to return home, rendering our most sacred national document, the Australian passport, a powerless scrap of paper. The COVID years are now behind us, but as we recover from the trauma, many experts are saying that we simply must have a thorough, wide and deep inquiry into how we handled things and what went wrong, because a lot did. A new study from Lund University in Sweden shows that the light touch approach to lockdowns taken by Swedish authorities during the COVID crisis was actually right, despite early criticism. In this important podcast-length interview pre-recorded for this week's episode of The Other Side, I'm joined by Australian National University Professor Ramesh Thakur. Dr. Thakur is Emeritus Professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. He's a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Brownstone Institute. And he was previously the Senior Vice Rector of the United Nations University and an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. We'll break the discussion into segments throughout tonight's show for you. Dr. Thakur started by telling me that Australia must learn from the more moderate response of the Swedes because it greatly reduced excess mortalities, other health problems, and economic damage. Ramesh, thank you very, very much for your time. It's great to have you on the other side.
It's good to be back, Damian.
Yeah, we've had you before, but not in the flesh, not in real life, in real time. So it's good to have you here. That was a wonderful speech at the Brownstone Institute last year, which we played a significant amount of in an earlier episode. But I just want to talk to you about this recent article that you've written for the Spectator a couple of weeks back. You were talking about a new study and 3 news reports that had come out. So to just bring us up to speed on where things are at in terms of the analysis post-COVID crisis that we're doing now and what we've learned and how much people are taking away from it all. The first thing was this academic study that highlighted this continuing confusion over the gravity of the COVID threat. Just explain that study to us and what it was all about. That's involves Sweden. Yep.
The study is by 2 professors from Lund University in Sweden, which is just north of Copenhagen. In the early months of 2020, when Sweden held out, and essentially the equivalent of their chief medical officer, Anders Tegnell, the state epidemiologist, he said, look, we have the existing plans, we have the previous studies, we've looked at what the countries are doing, and we understand neither the historical nor the scientific basis for that. So we will stay with the existing plans, which is a light touch. We give as reliable and accurate information and up-to-date information as we have to the citizens, give our recommendations, but we are not going to require shutdowns or any other thing that's mandatory. And they stayed with that. They were criticized very heavily as their death rates spiked in the early months. But then as that fell and it became clear by the mid-21 at the very latest, if not earlier, that in fact Sweden was doing quite well. It was not suffering excess deaths compared to the European averages and its neighboring countries. And its economic impacts were going to be a lot more moderate because their policies were more restrained. And then the press...
I sort of remember that. I remember that criticism, Ramesh, early on when people were saying, oh no, Sweden's taken the wrong path. Look at the number of deaths that they've got. And people were saying it about the United States as well. But
and
didn't they actually,
didn't
they suffer a higher mortality rate at the time?
No, this is the curious thing. So now, and remember Tegnell said at the time that give us 1 to 2 years before we look at the results in comparison to other countries.
Wow.
Sweden now has just about the lowest excess mortality rate in all of the OECD and very, very, obviously very low in Europe. So these 2 people looked at 2 things. They looked at the health outcomes, in particular measuring all-cause mortality, which is the one measure that is impossible to game and manipulate. And then they looked at the longer-term non-health outcomes, at least non-COVID related health outcomes. So they did look at other health and at mental health and at educational, social outcomes. And the conclusion is that on excess mortality, Sweden is at one of the lowest ends in terms of damage to your economy and other collateral harms, shall we say. Again, Sweden performs very well compared to the others. So the benefits of lockdowns were at best negligible. The long-term harms on the health side in terms of deferred screenings of essential tests that are used to detect critical conditions in time when they are treatable as opposed to later when they're not. The fear that was promulgated by most countries, as a result of which people thought it's too scary to go into hospital, I don't want to go, I might catch an infection there. Or they thought on the positive side, they are overstressed and it'd be better if I don't go, let other people with COVID go. So now those are showing up, particularly in relation to cancers and diabetes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So the benefits were negligible of the measures, and the benefits of a moderate restraint policy on the economic side. What has happened is that instead of an employment creating scheme, those have turned into a welfare crisis, as we see with ballooning debt, including in Australia.
Yeah, it was basically like, we had one problem. It was the old story of, everything looks like a nail to a man with a hammer. The governments did not
I think
take...
it was worse than that, Damian. I think what happened was we turned our entire health service into a COVID health service.
Yes.
Then we turned entire public policy into COVID policy. That was absolute madness.
And we ran all these countries based on one number, one metric, which was a very, very poor, statistically poor number to run it on. We didn't even know what the real numbers were. The numbers were terrible.
And we used wild assumptions in the models, and models were taken as science. Modeling was taken as scientific research. Model scenarios were taken as hard data. And it was all garbage in, garbage out phenomenon. So yes, we should have stuck to, we actually had hard data that we ignored. The Diamond Cruise, the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess.
Yes.
And the two warships, the Theodore Roosevelt in the US Navy and the Charles de Gaulle in the French Navy. And at two ends of the spectrum in terms of age, you had the elderly living in confined quarters before the world becomes aware of COVID and people got infected. And the infection and mortality rate were nowhere near the Spanish flu. They were at the bad end of a bad flu season. With the Roosevelt and the Charles de Gaulle, you had very, very, very low mortality. So it confirmed that it's an age-related thing. Even for the elderly, it is not as bad as the Spanish flu. And we should always have focused on the most vulnerable, which was the 65 and over, particularly with critical underlying conditions. So the Great Barrington Declaration is 100% vindicated by now.
Yeah. I never thought of it like that. You've got the perfect sample.
Absolutely.
You've got a ship with elderly people on it, a cruise ship, and then you've got a perfect control group. You've got these military ships that have got young people on them only.
And healthy young people, yep.
And you can compare directly. So first of all, on the ship with the elderly, as you're saying, the mortality wasn't as high as you would have thought if we were meant to be that worried about it overall.
And then on the younger ships, like 14 people out of the 3,000, 4,000 died.
Yeah. And then in close quarters, even if they're locked in their rooms, they still have to be in that confined space.
Well, they were engaged in extensive social interaction before the lockdowns came, before people realized there was a disease outbreak.
So we had that. I mean, essentially, that was an experiment. That was enough data, wasn't it? And we had
it was a perfect petri dish. Yep.
Perfect petri dish, and we blew it. Wow. Yep. Okay, so it really was a mass hysteria. We had Sweden doing the opposite. Thank God somebody had the guts to do that. So we do have someone that we can look at now and say, okay, this is how we should manage it if it ever happens again. But Ramesh, it's very hard to get past this idea.
By the way, is one of the major conclusions of this study that we're talking about. They make the point that public policy decisions should never be made in panic.
Yes.
In this case, we had existing plans, we had a century's worth of data and experience and science conveniently summarized in national plans, which we had in Australia, and in the WHO report, which was published as recently as September 2019. And we just threw it all out and panicked.
Yeah. Did you like that content? If you did, there's a lot more where that came from. It comes from a show called The Other Side, and it drops every Friday at 8 p.m. on Australia's ADH.tv, which you can watch for free on any browser. Or you can watch us right here on YouTube. Just remember to please support us by subscribing. Punch that subscribe button and the little bell next to it. Do it now, please.